What we can say, and we can do it very, very well, is talk about what is happening on the ground. Right? What is the soldier that gets the order at the end? How does he act? Right? And try to understand from that what the wider picture is.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 21 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org. We begin again with video from Egypt from the Moiserine Film Collective. The al-Sisi military regime, which has killed thousands of demonstrators, has now passed a law that makes it extremely difficult for anyone to demonstrate. People are required to obtain 7 permits before any demonstration of more than 10 people is legally allowed. To protest this act, there was a demonstration. The bulk of our show will be the first part of a talk given by former active duty Israeli soldier Avner Gvaryahu. He's from the Breaking the Silence group. He spoke in New Haven in October. He was on a book tour to promote his group's book, Our Harsh Logic, a record of 145 testimonies of Israeli soldiers who are unhappy with what they are forced to do in the occupied territories. He did not emphasize violent outrages. He spoke of the routine, the searches at 2 in the morning, the occupations of homes for days, the pointing of rifles at whole families, all in an effort to maintain the rule of constant fear and intimidation. We begin in Cairo, Egypt. There were several arrests, but at this demonstration there were no killings of protesters. Let me remind you that the Obama administration, in defiance of U.S. law, has not recognized the obvious that the Egyptian military staged a coup and became the government of Egypt. There's only been a partial suspension of U.S. aid to Egypt, to the military, and this has been done very quietly. In contrast, on November 21st, Secretary of State Kerry talked about Egypt, but only to denounce the former Muslim Brotherhood government. A few days later, a group of girls who had staged a peaceful protest in October in support of the overthrown President Morsi were given grotesque sentences of 11 years in prison. Whether they want a restoration of the Morsi presidency or a more fundamental democratic revolution in Egypt, certainly activists sympathetic to the people there can unite in denouncing the policies of the Kerry and Obama administration. Now to the talk by Israeli veteran Avner Gvaryahu.
As of today, Breaking the Silence, the organization that I'm here to represent, met close to 1,000 soldiers. They all served in the West Bank in these years, some of them very recent. We meet about 120, 100 soldiers per year, just because that's the amount of soldiers we can meet as an organization. And what we did in this book was, for the first time, try to do a little bit of analysis to what's happening on the ground. And that's what I'm going to spend a little bit of our time together talking about. But first of all, I'll introduce myself. 28, live in Tel Aviv, born and raised religious, or religious nationalist, or religious Zionist. I went to a religious high school. And I, of course, joined the army like my father before me, like my older brother. And I started serving in the West Bank in November 2004. I served in the Special Operations Unit of the Paratrooper Brigade. And I served for 3 years till the end of 2007, November 2007. Now, I don't know if this will surprise you, but the first time I ever met a Palestinian was after a year after I finished my training, a year into the army, when we were sent to do our first mission, which was basically going into a house middle of the night, putting all the family in one room and using the house, something called a straw widow. Ever hear this term before, straw widow? Any of you? In Hebrew it's called almanat kash. It's taking over a house for military purposes. Now this isn't something that happens every so often. This is procedure. This is something that is, I can't even remember how many houses I entered. It's not extreme. That's what you do. And with this first experience, I continued on my service. And I guess you can understand that there's no potential to see Palestinians as, of course, not equal to you as a soldier. Of course, not equal to settlers, right? But there's this some point during your service where you stop seeing them at all. And I continued on in this reality for 3 years. When I look back and think of how I continued in it, how I justified it to myself, I don't have a good answer. But when I was about to finish my service, I would say a couple months before the end of my service, one of the weekends home, someone that was already finished with his army service, during a talk or discussion we had, he says, "You should read this." And he hands over this black booklet of testimonies. And I read, it says, "Breaking the Silence, Hebron, 2004, something like that." And I take the booklet with me and I read it on the way to the base. And I understand that these are testimonies of soldiers that didn't serve with me, served in a different unit, didn't serve in the same area. I served mostly around Nablus and Jenin. They served in Hebron, which is south in the West Bank, right? This is a map of the West Bank. So if we're talking about Jenin, we're talking about Nablus over here. Here's Ramallah, Jerusalem, and Hebron is right down here. So they served in a different area than me, but still, the testimonies that I read were amazingly similar to my experiences. While reading through these testimonies, for me that was I look at it as a politicizing moment, where I realized that my story was part of a much bigger reality, and if you'd like, maybe a story of a generation. And that's when I said I have the responsibility, first of all, to learn more about it, but then maybe to help change this. And when I finished my service, I went on a tour to the South Hebron Hills, the most southernest tip of the West Bank. And I went on a tour led by people in Breaking the Silence. And I found myself in a Palestinian village called Susia in the South Hebron Hills. Standing there, I remember that a year and a half earlier, I was guarding the settlement of Susia. And that gave me an important lesson, I think, that I've carried with me, of this idea of perspectives. How standing in one side of the hill, all the Palestinians of Susia were my enemies. And suddenly I'm standing inside the Palestinian village and I'm hearing what they have to live through, with attacks from settlers and invasions by soldiers. And for me that was a moment saying, that was the beginning of a journey. Eventually I gave a testimony myself to Breaking the Silence, and I've been involved with the organization ever since. And I'm now on this wide speaking tour across the US. Most of what I do in Israel is I guide tours to today, myself, to Hebron, to the South Hebron Hills, to bring as many people as we can down to see what's happening on the ground. Breaking the Silence as an organization started in 2004. Unlike me, who came individually and gave a testimony, the guys who started breaking the silence came as a group, about 60 of them, who served in Hebron during the peak of the Second Intifada, had a feeling that I feel, that most of the soldiers giving us testimonies feel, but they felt it as a group, right? And in this group dynamic, they said, what we have to do is we have to talk about this reality, and what they felt very strongly, this unbelievable gap between what they were asked to do day in and day out, controlling a civilian population in one of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank, between what people back home knew about what they were actually asked to do. So there's only 38 kilometers, which is half an hour, basically, from Jerusalem to Hebron. But these two cities are light years away. And by going back home every weekend, every other weekend, understanding that no one back home can even understand what they were doing, they realize there's a problem. Because how do you bring back home to your family, right? How do you come home to the weekend and sit on the dinner table and say, Mom, Dad, you know where I was yesterday, last night? Tried to explain to them what a curfew means, what an arrest means, right? What the fear of the people that you're entering their houses is. And in the end of the day, what they decided to do is put together an exhibition of photos. And unlike what you would maybe imagine, they didn't take pictures of, if you'd like, what we see today as the classical pictures of occupation. They took pictures that they were taking of themselves, all pictures that soldiers took, in positions of soldiers like Israelis like to see them, smiling soldiers, in day-to-day reality in the base. And underneath these pictures, they told their stories. They gave their testimonies. And they thought that this will create some sort of discussion. I don't think that they knew back then what kind of discussion, but they were blown away with the interest. In 2 weeks alone, thousands of Israelis came to hear them, talk to them, listen to them. They showed in a gallery in Tel Aviv and in Haifa. They were also invited to meet people in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. But maybe two most important things that happened with this initial breaking the silence was, the first one is they realized what the big story they have, what a responsibility they have, and this helped form breaking the silence. The second thing that had happened, maybe even more important than that, is that people, soldiers, that were on their weekend off of the army came to see the exhibition. They heard about it in the news, they heard about it from friends, and they said, let's go see what people are talking about. And while these soldiers that didn't serve with them, were from different places, were walking through the exhibition, they were saying, what's the big deal? We also did this. It's not only you guys in Hebron, we also did this. Why are people interested in this? And that's when they realized how widespread this is, and how much it's not only about them in Hebron, but much more of a bigger picture. If you'd like, this really story of a generation. And that's when Breaking the Silence started, and today, like I said, we gather testimonies from soldiers from every unit, every place, every time. We imagine soldiers always with helmets and guns, but today in the West Bank you have dozens and dozens of soldiers and dozens of units that are actually they have desk jobs, right? And occupation is turned in such an integral part of the reality today on the ground that it's not only about soldiers and checkpoints, right? But it's about the body called the civil administration, which I'll say a word about. It's about people that are in observation rooms, sitting in front of cameras, right? And there's a whole widespread of how this occupation is continuing, or in a word, how we continue to control the Palestinians. What we do today is, the heart of our work is gathering these testimonies. Like I said, we meet about 100 soldiers a year. We met till today close to 1,000 soldiers. The second part of our work is educational work. We publish these testimonies in these black booklets, like the one I got. You can find them all on our website. Download them for free. We have different publications from different times, different places, geographical areas. There's a whole publication about female testimonies. which we find very important, very interesting. I think one of the most important testimonial books we put together was after Operation Cast Lead, and probably the most controversial one as well, but still the one we're probably the most proud of. But after about a decade of gathering testimonies, we said maybe it's about time to do a little bit more, and I'll say a word about that. But beside this educational work we do, it doesn't only stay there. We're not only about putting the information out there, we are about changing this reality of occupation. And we'll try to get the information out there to whoever could be relevant for this change. We do spend most of our efforts in Israel, and most of our efforts meeting with Israelis. 60% of our work is with Israelis in Israel. These tours are rare, and we're heavily criticized for them, for speaking outside of Israeli society, right? What people call airing our dirty laundry. But in that sense, first of all, it's not only our dirty laundry. There's millions of Palestinians living there. But you know, part of the reason that I'm here in front of you today, I mean, I walked around with a gun that said on it, "Colt, property of the USA government." Right? So to think this is only an internal Israeli issue is factually not true. And in our perspective, it's much more dangerous to keep things quiet. So that's a little bit about me and the organization. I'd like to just, when we started working on this book, you know, it was really after working for many years and hearing a lot of soldiers and getting a lot of stories. But we said maybe it's about time that we talk a little bit about, you know, what it is that is maintaining this reality that we're talking about. Now, before I say what's in the book, I think it's important to say what we don't have in the book. So what we don't have in the book is testimonies of Palestinians, right? We don't have in the book testimonies of settlers, right? Or high-ranking generals, or people in the Secret Service, or government officials, right? That's important to say. We can't say what the intentions are of these people either. What we can say, and we can do it very, very well, is talk about what is happening on the ground. Right? What is the soldier that gets the order at the end? How does he act? Right? And try to understand from that what the wider picture is. Now, what we did is we chose, we'll have this up here, we chose to use words that are very well known to us as soldiers and to most Israelis, and talk about, if you'd like, the 4 pillars of occupation. Right? What is allowing this reality to continue? Right? What are these 4 legs, if you'd like, of this table, which is called occupation? And we took 4 words, which were actually also our orders as soldiers. I mean, we didn't invent them. What we did is we're trying basically to show people what are these tools that we're taking out of the toolbox, right, that is maintaining this reality. And we chose 4 words, and what we try to do in the book is translate them into the actual thing they mean today. Now, when we started working on the book, I think that, and I think this is definitely what most people still today think about the reality, that even if there's problems and it doesn't look good and whatnot, in the end of the day, it's part of this idea of security, right? Maybe security of the borders, maybe even security of the settlers. And then we can think if that's legitimate or not. But the interesting thing we found is that today Israel is spending the vast majority of its efforts, not in a defensive action, but actually in offensive actions. Now, I think that in that sense, when we're talking about this reality that we've been in for a very long time, some would call it the status quo that we're in, there's this thought that the status quo is sort of frozen. I think what we can try to show is how not only does this reality maintain just the status quo and deny any sort of ability of Palestinians to evolve or to grow or to unite in that sense, but it's also entrenching ourselves in the current situation. Maybe I'll start out with the first chapter we talk about in the book, this idea of prevention. Right? When we talk about the 4 chapters are prevention, separation, fabric of life, and law enforcement. Now we talk about this idea of prevention. I'm not going to go into all of them, just talk about prevention. Prevention is also the longest chapter of the book and probably the most interesting one and affects all the rest of the chapters. When we talk about the word prevention, or in Hebrew sikul, the first thing that comes to mind to most Israelis when they hear this word sikul is sikul memukad, which basically means targeted preventions, which is a nice way to say assassinations. Right? Now the example that's always given is a scenario of a ticking bomb. Right? Now we can go into a debate, which I think is an interesting and important one, which I know is also, maybe happening in the US or not enough happening in the US, or what is a legitimate tool to stop this ticking bomb. Now it's an interesting discussion and an important one, but it usually ends there. Right? And then people will say you can't, people say you can, and then what are your borders, what are your boundaries, but you can harm people, and we know this discussion. But the interesting thing, which I think is much more relevant to what is happening today on the ground, is understand how this idea of prevention, with giving this example of a targeted prevention, has become wider and wider and wider. Now, the question is, what are we actually preventing? Now, Israel, we know, assassinates people who they see as ticking bombs. Right? Someone on his way to blow himself up, a Palestinian on his way to blow himself up in a checkpoint or blow himself up in a city. But we also know today, and this is where this idea becomes wider and wider, is that Israel not only assassinates people who are ticking bombs, but also assassinates people that they theoretically could arrest, that are not strapped on their way to blow themselves up, but are maybe involved in a violent group or what Israel calls a terrorist organization, right? Or is involved in different resistant groups. So when we're talking about how this triangle becomes wider, so Israel also assassinates people that they cannot get their hands on, but are not taking bombs. Right? And we can continue on in how wide this becomes. I mean, I served between 2004 and 2007, after the Second Intifada, and we got orders in the streets of Nablus and Jenin, anyone holding a gun, you shoot to kill. And we can, endure, and we have in our testimonies things that will sometimes surprise you, that in certain realities, Palestinian with binoculars you shoot to kill, or with a cell phone. But the widest sense of this idea of prevention is actually revenge attacks. We know of at least a dozen revenge attacks. One of the most famous ones is in February 2002. 6 Israeli soldiers were killed in a checkpoint near Ramallah, checkpoint called En Arik. The next night, 3 different units were sent to 3 different places, and the orders they got, everyone standing in a checkpoint, you shoot to kill. 15 Palestinian policemen were found dead. Right? One near Ramallah, checkpoint near Nablus, and a checkpoint near Gaza. Right? I mean, you see if we're talking about very simple map, right? The West Bank. So here's Gaza, right? Here is Ramallah. There's a whole country in between, right? Now, when we talk about this idea of prevention, how wide it was, I mean, this idea of targeted prevention is one example. But it continues on. What about arrests? Right? So you go and arrest someone. Let's say you don't drop a 10-ton bomb at him or a half-a-ton bomb at him, but you go and arrest him. Then the question is, who do you arrest? Who do you arrest? So people think, and they can, again, the discussion could be interesting, is it legitimate to arrest them, not legitimate, who is Israel to... But that's where the discussion ends. But we know that Israel not only arrests, and we read this testimony when we started the discussion, right? Israel not only arrests people that they see as a threat, but the widest sense of arrests And we know that Israel, I remember going to someone's house, he's not there, you arrest his cousin or his brother, his neighbor. Eventually you take someone with you, but we also know about mass arrests. We just read about one in Chares, but this comes up over and over again. Everyone between 18 and 29, 18 and 39. And another, there's many more examples, but there's one of the stories that comes up again and again, this idea of how you're pulling out gunmen, right? You're going to go into a Palestinian city, drive around and be this decoy to pull people out, and then you can shoot them, right? So this idea of prevention, the best defense is offense, right? So we won't have it in our borders, we'll push it into the hearts of the Palestinian cities. And maybe the top or the peak of this reality of having your presence felt, the peak of this reality of prevention is this order, having your presence felt, right? Showing that you're constantly there, you're constantly in control.
More of Gvaryahu's talk on our program next week. Now, if you like our videos, go to our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. We have over 900 videos there for your viewing pleasure. By the time you see this program, we'll have achieved over 500,000 views. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.